Hey, tonight we're going to dive deep into the real Wild West. Not the one you've seen in the movies with all the heroic cowboys and the dramatic showdowns at high noon, but the actual gritty, dangerous reality of it, a place where just surviving another day was never a guarantee. You might think you're tough enough to make it, but believe me, there's a very good reason they called it wild. If you're enjoying these stories, it would mean the world to me if you'd take a second to hit that like button or maybe even subscribe. It helps out more than you could possibly know. I'm always so curious to hear where everyone is listening from. So go ahead and drop a comment with your city and what time it is where you are. I love seeing our little global community come together through these shared stories. All right, now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background noise, and let's just ease into tonight's journey together. We are about to explore exactly why you might not survive a single day on the untamed American frontier. Congratulations, you've just woken up in the American Wild West, sometime in the 1870s. The good news is you're about to witness a legendary chapter of history with your own two eyes. The bad news? Your chances of seeing tomorrow just took a nosedive. The very first challenge hits you before you even manage to open your eyes. It's the smell, and it's not the earthy, pleasant aroma of nature you might be picturing. It's something far, far more pungent, the stench of unwashed bodies, of animal droppings, and what you can only guess is raw sewage just hanging heavy in the air. You see, taking a bath wasn't exactly a top priority in the Wild West. For most settlers, a thorough wash was a monthly luxury, and that's putting it generously. Some folks went entire winters without a proper bath. Water, you have to understand, was precious out here, and using it to clean your body seemed like a tremendous waste when you needed every drop for drinking and for cooking. As you drag yourself out of bed, which is probably just a mattress stuffed with straw and crawling with bed bugs, you become aware of how every single muscle in your body is screaming in protest. Life on the 1870s frontier meant constant, relentless physical labor from the moment the sun came up until long after it went down. There were no weekends off, no paid vacations, and certainly no thought given to ergonomics. It didn't matter if you were a farmer, a miner, or a ranch hand. Your body was your main tool, and you used it until it finally broke down. You might think you work hard in your modern life, but the labor on the frontier was a different beast entirely. It was backbreaking work that left even the strongest people permanently hunched over and arthritic by the time they were in their 30s. Just imagine spending 14 hours a day plowing fields, hauling heavy buckets of water, chopping wood, or working deep underground in a dark mine shaft. It's no wonder the average life expectancy was only about 35 years old. Standing on the dusty floorboards, you notice the sharp chill in the air. If it happens to be winter, your little cabin might be 20 degrees below freezing on the inside. If you were lucky enough to have a fireplace, you would have let the fire burn down overnight just to save what little precious fuel you had. Good luck finding any central heating or thermal underwear in this century. And if it's summer, well, you'd better get ready to sweat through every single piece of clothing you own. There was simply no escaping the elements in the Wild West. Speaking of clothes, you can forget all about comfort. Men typically owned maybe 2 sets of clothing, rough pants made of canvas or denim, and cotton shirts that constantly chafed against their skin. Women, on the other hand, wore multiple layers no matter how hot it was. We're talking chemises, corsets, petticoats, and long, heavy dresses that dragged in the dirt. Everything was scratchy, it was ill-fitting, and it was hardly ever cleaned. Those fancy, tailored outfits you've seen in the Western movies? That was pure fiction for the average person. Your stomach starts to growl, reminding you that it's time for breakfast. I hope you like beans, biscuits, and coffee because you might be having it for every single meal. The diet in the Wild West was incredibly monotonous and seriously deficient in nutrients. Fresh fruits and vegetables were a seasonal luxury. Meat, when you could get it, was usually preserved with a ton of salt or smoked because refrigeration just didn't exist yet. Scurvy, a nasty disease caused by a lack of vitamin C, the one that makes your gums bleed and your teeth fall out, was shockingly common among settlers, even though we now know it's easily preventable. You might think that at least the coffee would be good. Cowboys always seem to have a pot brewing over the fire in the movies. But what you're being served barely resembles the coffee you'd recognize. It's typically boiled to within an inch of its life, making it bitter beyond belief. And it might even have crushed eggshells or a pinch of salt thrown in to try and cut that bitterness. Still, the caffeine would help you face the day ahead, so you drink it down without a word of complaint. Before you step outside, you might want to check your shoes for any scorpions or snakes that could have crawled in seeking shelter during the night. It wasn't at all uncommon for folks on the frontier to shake out their boots every single morning, a habit that was born from painful personal experience. One wrong move, one moment of carelessness, and you could be dealing with a venomous bite miles and miles from any kind of medical help. Stepping out of your cabin, you're immediately struck by how exposed you are. The vast landscape of the American frontier was breathtaking, there's no doubt about that, but it was also completely unforgiving. Extreme weather could roll in with very little warning. Blizzards, tornadoes, flash floods, or crippling droughts could all mean death for anyone who was unprepared. The sky might be clear and blue right now, but that could change in a matter of minutes. If you've settled down in a frontier town, you might think that civilization offers some kind of protection. And in some ways that's true, but in other ways it just introduces a whole new set of dangers. Towns in the Wild West were breeding grounds for disease. Without any proper sewage systems or any real understanding of germ theory, illnesses could spread through a community like wildfire. Cholera, typhoid, smallpox, diphtheria, and tuberculosis were constant looming threats. A single outbreak could wipe out half a town in just a few weeks. Speaking of towns, let's say you decide to pay one a visit today. As you get closer, you notice there's a distinct lack of the organized layout you might expect. Many Western towns just grew haphazardly, with buildings put up wherever it was convenient, often without any real planning or infrastructure. The streets aren't paved. Instead, they are just dirt tracks that turn into deep mud pits when it rains and choking dust bowls when it's dry. The smell hits you again, only stronger now. Horse manure is absolutely everywhere because horses are the main form of transportation. There are no street cleaners, no sanitation departments. In some towns, the accumulated waste could be knee-deep in the most heavily trafficked areas. Flies swarm all around you, and you suddenly understand exactly why disease spreads so easily here. As you walk down the main street, you pass the saloon, which is likely one of the busiest places in town. Contrary to what Hollywood has shown you, saloons weren't glamorous establishments with swinging doors and talented piano players. Most of them were crude, one-room buildings with rough plank bars and some basic furniture. The liquor they served wasn't fine whiskey aged in oak barrels. It was raw alcohol, often mixed with things like tobacco juice, pepper, turpentine, or even gunpowder to give it an extra kick. A single drink of that stuff could literally blind you if you were unlucky. The saloon represents another deadly part of frontier life: violence. These places were frequently the site of deadly confrontations, not because of any formal duels or showdowns, but because of drunken arguments that escalated in a flash in a society where nearly everyone was heavily armed. The romanticized gunfights from the Western movies were actually quite rare. Most of the violence was impulsive, it was messy, and it was usually over something trivial. Speaking of being armed, you'll notice that almost everyone is carrying a weapon of some kind, but not for the reasons you might be thinking. While personal protection was certainly part of it, weapons were primarily tools. They were used for hunting, for protection from wildlife, and sometimes for signaling. The constant threat from bears, wolves, cougars, and venomous snakes made going unarmed a foolish decision, especially if you were traveling between settlements. You might be surprised to learn that many frontier towns actually had strict gun control laws. Places like Dodge City, Kansas, and Tombstone, Arizona required visitors to check their firearms when they entered the town limits. The famous gunfight at the OK Corral actually started because the Clanton gang refused to comply with Tombstone's weapons ordinance. Despite what you've seen in the movies, quick-draw duels in the middle of the street were exceedingly rare. Most shootings were ambushes or they happened during robberies. The idea of a skilled gunslinger facing off against an opponent at high noon is largely a Hollywood invention. Real frontier violence was typically sudden, chaotic, and it lacked any sense of honor or fairness. As you continue your walk, you pass the local doctor's office. Medical care on the 1870s frontier would absolutely horrify you. Most doctors had very little, if any, formal training. Surgical procedures were performed without any anesthesia beyond a stiff drink of whiskey or some morphine, and the concept of sterilization was virtually unknown. Something as simple as an infected cut could easily lead to an amputation or death. Common treatments included bloodletting, mercury compounds, arsenic, and other toxic substances that often did more harm than good. Women in childbirth faced mortality rates as high as 1 in 4 in the more remote areas. Dentistry usually just involved pulling a tooth without any anesthesia, using crude, unsterilized tools. Most people suffered from painful dental problems for years before they finally just lost their teeth. If you were injured or you fell ill on the frontier, your survival often depended more on pure luck than on any medical intervention. Even minor injuries could become life-threatening because of infection. Broken bones might never heal properly, leaving people on the frontier with chronic pain and permanent disabilities. The famous phrase, "only the strong survive," had a very literal meaning in the Wild West. Your stomach growls again and you realize it's about time for lunch. You head to the local eatery, which is likely just a room in someone's home where they serve meals for a fee. The food isn't any more varied than what you had for breakfast. The meat is tough and often on the verge of spoiling, despite being heavily smoked or salted. Vegetables, if they're even available, are cooked until they're mush. Food safety standards don't exist at all. So, dysentery and food poisoning are common problems. While you're eating, you overhear conversations about recent Indian attacks, outlaw gangs, or the dangers of traveling alone. While violence from Native Americans against settlers was far less common than it's been portrayed in popular culture. In fact, settlers and the US military were much more likely to be the aggressors. The frontier was still a place of conflict. The systematic displacement of indigenous peoples created tensions that sometimes erupted into violence on both sides. As for outlaws, they were a genuine threat, particularly in the remote areas. Law enforcement was sparse, with a single sheriff sometimes being responsible for thousands of square miles. In many places, justice was handled through vigilante action rather than through any formal legal proceedings. Lynch mobs were common, and the whole concept of innocent until proven guilty often didn't apply. If you were accused of stealing a horse or rustling cattle, you might find yourself hanging from a tree before the sun went down, regardless of your actual guilt or innocence. After lunch, you decide to visit the local general store to get some supplies. The prices are shocking. Basic necessities cost far more on the frontier than they did back east because of the difficulty and the expense of transportation. A simple can of peaches might cost the equivalent of $20 in today's money. Many settlers spent most of their income on essential supplies, with very little left over for any kind of comfort or luxury. The store offers another glimpse into the reality of the frontier, the isolation. Mail delivery was infrequent and unreliable. Newspapers might be weeks or even months out of date. Information traveled incredibly slowly, and you might go for years without hearing any news from your family back east. Many settlers never saw their relatives again after they moved west. The psychological toll of this isolation contributed to high rates of depression, alcoholism, and suicide among the people living on the frontier. As the afternoon wears on, you notice dark clouds starting to gather on the horizon. The weather on the frontier wasn't just uncomfortable, it could be deadly. Without any modern forecasting, storms arrived with very little warning. Blizzards could strand travelers, leading to them freezing to death. Tornadoes could destroy entire communities with no emergency services to help the survivors. Flash floods could wash away entire wagon trains. Droughts ruined crops and led to starvation. If you were lucky enough to have a proper home, it provided only minimal protection. Most frontier dwellings were hastily built from whatever materials were available. There were sod houses on the plains, log cabins in the forested areas, or simple wooden structures in the towns. None of them were particularly effective against extreme weather. Winter temperatures inside could drop below freezing. The summer heat was often unbearable, especially in the attics or upper floors where many people slept. As the storm gets closer, you decide to head back to your cabin before it hits. On the way, you pass a group of men heading to work at the local mine. Mining was one of the most deadly professions on the frontier. Underground cave-ins, exposure to toxic gas, explosions from improperly handled blasting powder, and machinery accidents claimed countless lives. Miners also suffered from long-term health problems, like black lung from breathing in coal dust, or mercury poisoning from gold processing. Even if you avoided mining, very few jobs on the frontier were safe. Farming involved dangerous equipment that had no safety features. Ranching meant working with unpredictable animals that weighed hundreds of pounds. Logging had one of the highest fatality rates of any profession. Whatever you did to make a living, your risk of a serious injury or death was exponentially higher than it is in the modern world. You make it back to your cabin just as the rain begins to pour. The roof leaks in several places and you place buckets on the floor to catch the water. This is a good opportunity to refill your drinking water. Since clean water was so scarce and precious, many frontier settlers drank from the same sources they used for washing and for watering their livestock, which led to waterborne illnesses that could quickly turn fatal. As you sit there in your leaky cabin listening to the rain, you reflect on how different the reality is from the romanticized version of the Wild West. There were no clear heroes or villains, just people struggling to survive in incredibly harsh conditions. The fact that anyone made it through at all is a testament to human resilience and determination. Night falls early, since you have no electricity. Candles and oil lamps provide a minimal amount of light, and you're careful with them. Fire was a constant danger in frontier homes. A single spark could mean losing everything you own, with no fire department to call for help. Many towns burned completely to the ground at least once in their history. You get ready for bed, completely exhausted from just one day in the Wild West. Your muscles ache, your stomach is unsettled from the unfamiliar food, and your mind is overwhelmed by the constant vigilance that's required just to stay alive. As you drift off to sleep, you wonder if you'll even make it through tomorrow, or if you'll become just another statistic in the dangerous story of the American frontier. The wind howls outside your cabin, a haunting reminder of how small and vulnerable human beings are against the vastness of the untamed wilderness. Tomorrow, if you're lucky enough to see it, will bring all of these challenges all over again, along with new ones you haven't even imagined yet. In the Wild West, survival was never guaranteed. It was earned, day by day, hour by hour, through a level of hardship that most modern people can barely even comprehend. The morning light filters through the cracks in your cabin walls, waking you from a restless sleep. Your body aches from the hard mattress, but there's no time to linger. The Wild West doesn't wait for anyone. As you get up, you remember yesterday's harsh introduction to frontier life and can't help but wonder what new challenges today is going to bring. Let's say you decide to leave town today to travel across the frontier. Whether you're making your way to another settlement, joining a wagon train heading west, or just exploring, Travel in the 1870s was a completely different experience than anything you're used to. The good news is that by this time, the Transcontinental Railroad had been finished, connecting the east and west coasts of America. The bad news is, unless you were relatively wealthy or traveling between major cities, you probably couldn't afford to actually use it. Most people on the frontier traveled by horse, by wagon, or simply on foot. If you owned a horse, you should consider yourself fortunate. Horses were expensive to buy and to maintain, which put them out of reach for many settlers. A good horse might cost the equivalent of several months' wages. Then you had to buy saddles, bridles, feed, and pay for veterinary care. Though veterinary care often just meant shooting the animal if it broke a leg or came down with certain illnesses. Riding itself was no pleasure cruise. Saddles in the 1870s weren't designed for comfort, they were designed for function. Hours in the saddle left even the most experienced riders with blisters and aching muscles, and if your horse got spooked by a snake or a sudden noise, which happened all the time, you could easily be thrown, potentially suffering broken bones or worse, miles away from any kind of help. If you couldn't afford a horse, you might travel by wagon. You need to forget that romantic image of pioneers cheerfully rolling across pristine prairies. Wagon travel was brutally uncomfortable. The vehicles had no suspension system to speak of, beyond the slight give in the wooden wheels, which meant you felt every single rock, rut, and hole in the trail. The constant jarring motion caused wagon sickness, which is similar to seasickness, leaving travelers nauseous and absolutely miserable. Roads, if they even existed at all, were typically just dirt tracks that had been carved out by previous travelers. After a rain, they would become muddy quagmires where wagons could sink axle deep. During dry spells, the dust was so thick you could barely breathe or see. Wagons frequently broke down with wheels cracking or axles snapping miles from the nearest settlement. Let's say you've decided to make the journey all the way to California or Oregon. You've joined a wagon train heading west on the famous Oregon Trail. This 2,000-mile journey was one of the most perilous undertakings of the 19th century. Of the roughly 400,000 people who attempted it between the 1840s and 1860s, it's estimated that 1 in 10 didn't survive. The Oregon Trail was sometimes called the nation's longest graveyard. Some historians estimate that an average of 10 to 15 people died for every single mile of the trail. Just think about that for a second. A grave every 350 feet or so for 2,000 miles. The trail was literally lined with makeshift crosses and stone markers, many of them without names, as families were forced to bury their loved ones and then keep moving. Disease was the #1 killer on the Oregon Trail. Cholera, a bacterial infection that spread through contaminated water, was particularly devastating. This horrible illness, it caused severe diarrhea and vomiting, draining the body of fluid so quickly that a person could be perfectly healthy at breakfast and dead by dinner time. There was no effective treatment available. Wagon trains would sometimes lose dozens of people in a single cholera outbreak. Other diseases like dysentery, typhoid, and mountain fever claimed countless more lives. Children were especially vulnerable, with many families losing multiple children during the journey. Medical care was rudimentary at best, often consisting of folk remedies that did little to help and sometimes actually made conditions worse. Crossing rivers presented another deadly challenge. Wagons were not designed to float, but pioneers had to cross numerous rivers on their journey west. Some had ferries or fords, but many required the wagon to be floated across like some kind of makeshift boat. Wagons frequently capsized during these crossings, drowning people and livestock and destroying precious supplies. The Platte, Columbia, and Snake Rivers all claimed hundreds of lives during the migration period. Contrary to popular belief, attacks by Native Americans were relatively rare. Most tribes were actually helpful to the migrants, offering them supplies, guidance, and help with river crossings. The majority of violent deaths on the trail actually came from accidents, like being crushed by wagon wheels, drowning, or being kicked by draft animals. Firearms accidents were shockingly common, as most travelers were inexperienced with weapons but carried them for hunting and for protection. The psychological toll of the journey was immense. Families buried their children, their parents, and their spouses along the way, and then had to continue traveling immediately. There was simply no time for extended grief on the trail. Each day's delay meant less of a chance of crossing the mountains before the winter snows made the passes impossible. The constant stress, the grief, and the physical hardship led many travelers to a mental breakdown. Suicide was not uncommon among the migrants on the trail. If you somehow survived the journey to California or Oregon, your challenges were far from over. Many people arrived at their destination having spent all of their money and resources on the journey itself. Families often showed up destitute, malnourished, and sick, only to find that the promised land had its own set of harsh realities. But let's say you've decided not to travel quite that far. Perhaps you're just heading to a nearby town or settlement instead. Even short journeys in the Wild West presented significant dangers. Travelers might run into outlaws who saw lone riders or small groups as easy targets. While the frequency of stagecoach robberies was exaggerated in later fiction, they did happen regularly enough to be a legitimate concern. The natural environment posed constant threats to travelers. Flash floods could wash out trails or trap unwary travelers. The summer heat in desert regions could kill through dehydration and heat stroke. Winter blizzards routinely trapped travelers, sometimes leading to them freezing to death or to desperate situations like the infamous Donner Party, where the survivors resorted to cannibalism to stay alive. Navigation itself was a challenge in an era before detailed maps. Travelers had to rely on vague directions, landmarks that could change or be misidentified, and the experience of guides who sometimes proved to be unreliable. Getting lost in the wilderness could be a death sentence, especially if your supplies started to run low. As you travel today, you notice another aspect of frontier life that the movies rarely depict accurately: the stunning diversity of the people. The Wild West wasn't populated solely by white cowboys and settlers. It was a meeting ground of cultures from all around the world. Chinese immigrants worked as railroad builders, miners, and merchants. Mexican families had been living in the Southwest long before it ever became U.S. territory. Black cowboys made up as much as 25% of the workforce on some ranches. European immigrants from Germany, Ireland, Italy, and Scandinavia brought their own cultures and traditions with them. And of course, dozens of distinct Native American nations had called these lands home for thousands of years before anyone else arrived. This diversity, however, didn't mean there was equality or harmony. Racial violence was a common feature of frontier life. Chinese railroad workers faced brutal discrimination and were often forced to take the most dangerous jobs for lower pay than white workers. Mexican landowners frequently saw their property seized through legal manipulation or outright theft after the Mexican-American War. Black Americans who moved west hoping to escape Southern discrimination often found that the racism on the frontier was just as entrenched, even if it was different in its form. Despite their crucial contributions to ranching, mining, and building frontier communities, they were frequently excluded from economic opportunities and social acceptance. For Native Americans, the expansion of white settlement was nothing short of catastrophic. The indigenous population of North America, which once numbered perhaps 15 million people, had been reduced to fewer than 300,000 by the year 1900. Disease, warfare, forced relocation, and the deliberate destruction of their food sources, particularly the buffalo, decimated numerous tribes and nations. U.S. government policies systematically pushed Native Americans from their traditional lands onto reservations, often in areas with poor soil and few resources. Treaties were regularly broken whenever valuable resources were discovered on reservation lands. Native children were taken from their families and placed in boarding schools that were designed to erase their cultural identity, operating under the philosophy of kill the Indian, save the man. The romanticized cowboys versus Indians narratives of later films grossly misrepresented the complex interactions between settlers and indigenous peoples. Many native nations initially tried to accommodate the newcomers and adapt to the changing circumstances. Violence typically erupted only after repeated treaty violations, encroachment on tribal lands, or deliberate provocations. As you continue on your journey, you ponder another group whose experience was markedly different from the Hollywood depictions: women on the frontier. Far from the helpless damsels or schoolmarms of the Western movies, frontier women performed incredibly demanding physical labor while also navigating restrictive social expectations. On homesteads and farms, women not only handled all the traditional domestic duties like cooking, cleaning, childcare, and making clothing, but they also worked in the fields, tended to the livestock, and defended the home when it was necessary. Their workday typically started before dawn and ended well after dark, with few, if any, days of rest. A frontier woman might need to plow fields in the morning, deliver a neighbor's baby at midday, fight off predators that were threatening the livestock in the afternoon, and still prepare meals and care for her own children throughout the day. Many women became widows at a young age due to the dangerous nature of frontier life and had to manage farms or businesses all on their own while raising their children. Despite their essential contributions, women had very few legal rights. In most territories and states, they couldn't vote, they couldn't own property independently if they were married, and they couldn't have custody of their children in the event of a divorce. Domestic violence was considered a private matter, with little legal recourse available to the victims. For unmarried women, the options were severely limited. Teaching was one of the few respectable professions, though female teachers were paid significantly less than their male counterparts and were often expected to resign as soon as they got married. Some women found economic independence by running boarding houses, working as nurses, or establishing millinery or dressmaking businesses. Then there were the soiled doves, the prostitutes, who worked in frontier brothels and saloons. While later mythology has romanticized these women, the reality was typically grim. Many entered the profession out of pure economic desperation, after being widowed or abandoned. Physical abuse, drug addiction, and venereal disease were common hazards of the work. Even those who managed to earn a substantial amount of money found themselves socially ostracized and unable to transition into more respectable positions. Some women did find greater freedom on the frontier than they might have back east. The shortage of women in the Western territories gave them more marriage options and sometimes resulted in better treatment, as communities competed to attract and keep female residents. A few territories, like Wyoming and Utah, granted women the right to vote decades before the 19th Amendment, recognizing their essential contributions to the development of the frontier. As the day wears on and you continue traveling, you might start to wonder about law enforcement in this supposedly lawless land. The reality was complex and it varied widely depending on the location. Major cities and towns typically had some form of organized law enforcement, but the vast rural areas had minimal, if any, official protection. County sheriffs were elected officials who were responsible for maintaining order across sometimes enormous territories. A single sheriff might be the only law enforcement for thousands of square miles, which made regular patrols impossible. They relied heavily on deputizing ordinary citizens during emergencies, creating posses to pursue criminals or respond to violence. Town marshals handled law enforcement within the town limits, sometimes with a few deputies in the larger settlements. These positions were often dangerous and poorly paid, attracting a mix of dedicated public servants and those who just enjoyed the power that the badge provided. Some famous lawmen, like Wyatt Earp, moved between legitimate law enforcement and more questionable enterprises throughout their careers. Federal marshals had jurisdiction throughout the territories and states, but there were very few of them. They typically focused on major crimes like counterfeiting, mail robbery, or offenses that involved multiple jurisdictions. The legendary US Marshals of the Western movies who single-handedly brought law to lawless towns were largely fictional creations. In many remote areas, justice was handled through informal community action rather than through official legal processes. Vigilante groups formed to address perceived threats when formal law enforcement was absent or ineffective. Sometimes these groups managed to maintain a basic sense of order, but they could easily become vehicles for prejudice, personal vendettas, or mob violence. The iconic image of the quick-draw gunfight was largely a later invention. Most frontier violence was mundane, impulsive, and often fueled by alcohol. Bar fights that escalated to fatal levels, domestic violence, and disputes over land or livestock were far more common than dramatic shootouts on dusty streets. Criminal punishment was harsh by modern standards. Hanging was the standard penalty for murder, rape, and sometimes theft, particularly of horses or cattle. Prisons did exist, but they were primitive facilities with high mortality rates from disease, violence, and poor conditions. Many communities preferred immediate execution to the expense of long-term imprisonment. As evening approaches, you decide to seek shelter for the night. If you're lucky, you might find a town with a hotel or a boarding house. Don't expect any luxury. Frontier accommodations were basic at best. A typical hotel room would have a simple bed, possibly infested with bedbugs, a washstand with a pitcher and basin, and maybe a chair. The bathroom facilities would be an outhouse in the back, shared by all of the guests. Privacy was minimal, with thin walls that allowed you to hear your neighbor's every movement and conversation. In busier establishments, you might even have to share a bed with a stranger, a common practice to maximize capacity during busy periods. The sheets might not have been changed from the previous guests, and the lighting would be limited to candles or oil lamps. A night's lodging would cost between 25 cents and $1, depending on the establishment's quality and location. This represented a significant expense for many travelers, equivalent to several hours' wages for an average worker. Many people chose to sleep in stables, barns, or simply out under the stars to save money, despite the additional risks that these options presented. If you were traveling through more remote areas, you'd likely have to camp for the night. This meant building a fire, assuming you could find enough fuel, preparing a meal from your limited supplies, and sleeping on the hard ground with minimal protection from the elements or from wildlife. Indigenous peoples, experienced travelers, and military scouts had sophisticated techniques for safe camping. But the average settler often made dangerous mistakes. Proper fire management was literally a matter of life and death. A fire that was built too large could spark a prairie or forest fire that could consume thousands of acres in a matter of hours. One that was built too small might not provide enough warmth during cold nights, leading to hypothermia. Campfire cooking required skills that most modern people lack, often resulting in meals that were simultaneously burnt and raw. As night fully falls and you prepare to sleep, the sounds of the frontier darkness surround you. Coyotes howl in the distance. Unfamiliar birds call out. The wind whispers through the grass or the trees. For people who are accustomed to modern light and noise pollution, the profound darkness and the strange sounds of the wilderness nights often triggered intense anxiety. Many travelers slept poorly on the frontier, not just because of the physical discomfort, but from the fear of the unknown dangers that might be lurking in the darkness. Native attacks, though they were rare, often occurred at dawn when sleepers were at their most vulnerable. Predators like wolves, bears, and mountain lions might investigate camps looking for food. Venomous snakes and scorpions sought out warm places to rest, which sometimes included a sleeper's bedroll. Even if no actual threats materialized, the psychological stress of constant vigilance took its toll. Frontier diaries frequently mention exhaustion, not just from physical labor, but from the mental strain of perpetual alertness. Modern people, accustomed to locks, alarms, and the security of a dense population, would find the vulnerability of the frontier sleeping arrangements profoundly disturbing. As you drift towards sleep, you reflect on the day's journey. Travel in the Wild West bears almost no resemblance to its sanitized, romanticized portrayal in later entertainment. It was grueling, it was dangerous, and it was uncomfortable beyond what most modern people could possibly endure. The skills that were required, from navigation without maps to making emergency repairs to handling firearms safely, took years to develop, and mistakes were often fatal. The darkness deepens, and the sounds of the night creatures grow louder. Tomorrow will bring new challenges. If you survive the night, perhaps you'll finally reach your destination. Or perhaps you'll just become another unmarked grave along the trail. One more statistic in the perilous story of westward expansion. The Wild West forgave no weakness, and it offered no second chances. Every single day that was survived was a victory against overwhelming odds. The new day dawns on the frontier, and you've somehow managed to survive the night. That in itself is a victory out here in the Wild West. As you rub the sleep from your eyes and stretch your aching muscles, you start to contemplate what direction your frontier experience might take next. Today, perhaps you'll decide to try your luck in one of the booming mining towns, those places where fortunes are supposedly made overnight. You've heard the stories of the California gold rush, the silver strikes in Nevada, and the mining booms in Colorado. Tales of ordinary men stumbling upon nuggets the size of chicken eggs and becoming fabulously wealthy have drawn hundreds of thousands of people west. What those stories don't mention, though, are the brutal realities that were waiting for those who chased these mineral dreams. Let's say you decide to try your hand at mining. What would that actually look like? First, you'd have to stake a claim. That means finding a piece of unclaimed land that has potential mineral deposits, which was becoming increasingly difficult by the 1870s as all the easiest and richest areas had been claimed years earlier. If you were lucky enough to find a promising spot, you'd then need to register your claim at the nearest government office and pay the required fees, which could be substantial. Then the real work would begin, and it was some of the most physically demanding labor imaginable. For placer mining, which is searching for loose gold in streams, you'd spend hours on end bent over in ice-cold mountain water, sifting through sediment with a pan or a sluice box. Your hands would crack and bleed from the constant exposure to the water and rough materials. Your back would ache from being in that hunched-over position, and after all of that effort, you'd be lucky to find just a few tiny flakes of gold, worth only pennies. If you ventured into hard rock mining, digging for veins of ore deep in the mountains, the dangers multiplied exponentially. Tunneling into unstable rock without any modern safety equipment or engineering knowledge led to frequent cave-ins that crushed miners right where they stood. Poorly ventilated shafts would fill up with toxic gases like carbon monoxide, odorless but deadly, suffocating miners who had no warning of the danger. Blasting with black powder or dynamite to break through the rock was incredibly hazardous. Miners frequently lost fingers, hands, eyes, or their lives when charges detonated prematurely or when flying rock fragments became deadly projectiles. The thunderous noise and the constant percussion from the blasting left many with permanent hearing loss. Even if you managed to avoid any immediate catastrophes, the long-term health effects were devastating. Miners were constantly inhaling fine rock dust, which led to silicosis, a painful lung disease that slowly suffocated its victims. The mental deterioration. Those who worked in copper or lead mines absorbed toxic metals that accumulated in their bodies, causing chronic illness and an early death. The mining industry of the 1870s had virtually no safety regulations or oversight. The mine owners prioritized profit over the welfare of their workers, and injuries were just considered an expected part of the job. Medical care for injured miners was minimal and often ineffective. A serious injury typically meant the end of a miner's career and his livelihood, with no disability support or workers' compensation available. And for all of these risks and hardships, what was the likely reward? Despite the mythology of the lucky prospector, the vast majority of miners barely earned subsistence wages. By the 1870s, most of them worked for large mining companies rather than for themselves, earning $2 to $3 for a grueling 10 to 12-hour day. Studies suggest that the storekeepers, saloon owners, and prostitutes in these towns consistently made more money than the miners whose dreams kept the towns alive. Speaking of mining towns, they were notoriously rough places. Just imagine a community made up primarily of young single men, all engaged in dangerous work with very few women, families, or civilizing institutions. Alcohol consumption was astronomical. The average resident of a mining camp consumed several times more alcohol than the typical American does today. Violence was commonplace, with fights, stabbings, and shootings happening on a regular basis. Sanitation in these mining camps was typically abysmal, with minimal planning or infrastructure. Human waste and garbage just accumulated in the streets and waterways. Typhoid, cholera, and dysentery spread rapidly in these conditions. During the warm months, the stench could be overwhelming, and swarms of flies would spread disease from the waste to the food. If you did manage to find some valuable ore, you then faced the challenge of converting it into cash. Banking in the Wild West was primitive and often predatory. Many mining towns had no banks at all, which forced miners to carry around their gold dust or ore, making them prime targets for theft. Some saloons and general stores would offer to buy gold, but they frequently did so at rates that were far below its actual value, taking advantage of the miners' limited options. Where banks did exist, they operated with minimal regulation or oversight. Bank failures were common, often wiping out a customer's life savings without any warning or recourse. Many bankers were little more than confidence men who would set up a storefront, collect deposits, and then disappear overnight with all the funds. Without a federally backed currency, paper money was issued by individual banks, and its value fluctuated wildly depending on the bank's reputation. Counterfeit bills circulated widely, and even experienced merchants could be fooled by well-made fakes. The safest form of money was gold or silver coin, but carrying it around made you a target for robbery. Perhaps after considering all the dangers and disappointments of mining, you decide to try your hand at ranching instead. The cattle industry was booming in the 1870s, with the demand for beef in the eastern cities creating opportunities on the frontier. Surely this would be a healthier, more profitable venture. Ranching did indeed avoid some of the worst health hazards of mining, but it introduced its own unique dangers and hardships. Starting a ranch required a significant amount of capital. The land, the livestock, the equipment, and the buildings all represented major investments. Many aspiring ranchers went deeply into debt to purchase these necessities, betting their entire future on favorable weather and market conditions. Nature, however, often had other plans. Droughts could wither the grazing lands and dry up crucial water sources, forcing ranchers to either watch their cattle starve or sell them at devastating losses. Harsh winters could kill entire herds, as happened in the infamous Great Die-Up of 1886 to 1887, when up to 90% of the cattle on the northern ranges froze or starved to death during an unusually severe winter. Disease could sweep through a herd, wiping out a rancher's entire investment overnight. Texas fever, anthrax, and other infectious diseases had no effective treatments in the 1870s. Predators like wolves and cougars took a constant toll on the livestock, particularly the vulnerable calves. Poisonous plants, quicksand, and injuries from accidents further reduced the size of the herds. The iconic cattle drives moving herds hundreds of miles to railroad shipping points were not romantic adventures. They were grueling, dangerous undertakings. Cowboys, not the glamorous figures of later films, but typically young, poorly paid laborers, worked 20-hour days during these drives, catching only brief naps in the saddle as they moved thousands of animals across difficult terrain. These drives faced constant threats. River crossings could turn deadly in a matter of minutes if the animals panicked, creating deadly pileups that drowned both cattle and cowboys. Stampedes, which could be triggered by something as simple as a lightning strike or a snapping twig, turned thousands of 1,500-pound animals into an unstoppable, destructive force. Cowboys who were caught in a stampede were often trampled to death. The cowboy's life was far from the freedom that was portrayed in Western mythology. They typically earned about $30 a month for exhausting, dangerous work. Most of them were very young men, often teenagers from poor backgrounds with few other options. A significant percentage were black, Mexican, or of mixed race, individuals who were facing discrimination that limited their opportunities elsewhere. Their diet on the trail consisted mainly of beans, salt pork, and biscuits, with minimal fresh food. Medical care was limited to whatever the trail cook might know about folk remedies. Injuries, which were common in such a dangerous line of work, often went untreated until they became life-threatening. Many cowboys died young from injuries, exposure, or violence. Perhaps ranching doesn't appeal to you after all. What about farming? Surely growing food, the most fundamental of all human activities, would offer a more stable and less dangerous way of life on the frontier. The Homestead Act of 1862 had opened up vast areas of the West to settlement, offering 160 acres of free land to anyone who would live on it and improve it for 5 years. This seemed like an incredible opportunity, a chance for people with little money to become landowners and build independent livelihoods for themselves. The reality, however, proved to be far more challenging than the promise. First, 160 acres might sound like a lot, but in the arid regions that made up much of the available land, it was often not enough to support a family. The traditional Eastern farming methods failed in these environments where the rainfall was just a fraction of what the pioneers were used to. Many settlers had no knowledge of the dry farming techniques that were needed for success in these regions. Starting a frontier farm required a tremendous amount of physical labor. The very first task was to build a shelter, which was typically a sod house on the treeless plains, constructed by cutting and stacking dense prairie turf. These soddies were dark, damp dwellings that leaked whenever it rained, harbored insects and snakes, and would crumble without constant maintenance. Then came the back-breaking work of breaking the land for planting. The prairie sod was held together by dense grass roots that had developed over centuries, and it was extraordinarily difficult to plow with the equipment that was available to most settlers. It could take a year or more just to prepare a few acres for planting. The work was so physically demanding that it permanently damaged the bodies of many farmers. Once the crops were planted, farmers faced threats from every direction. A drought could wither the plants before the harvest. Torrential rains could wash away the seedlings or flood the fields. An early frost could kill the crops just before they were ready to be harvested. And then there were the grasshoppers, which would descend in biblical swarms, consuming every single green thing in their path, and sometimes even eating the wooden handles of the tools that were left out in the fields. Disease affected frontier farmers just as it did everyone else, but with particularly devastating consequences. With no hired help and very little community support, a family's illness during the crucial planting or harvesting periods could mean the difference between survival and starvation. Women often continued working in the fields while they were heavily pregnant, or just days after giving birth, risking their own health because the work simply couldn't wait. Farm accidents were common and often fatal. Homemade tools would break and cause injuries. Animals would panic and trample their handlers. Even a successful harvest could turn deadly. Numerous farmers died when they fell into grain storage bins and suffocated in the loose grain, or when poorly constructed storage buildings collapsed under the weight of their contents. The isolation of the frontier farms took a heavy psychological toll. Neighbors might be miles away and were visited only occasionally. Women, in particular, suffered from this isolation. Some went for months without speaking to anyone outside of their immediate family. Depression, Anxiety and what was then called prairie madness affected many settlers, sometimes leading to them abandoning their homesteads or even committing suicide. For those who persevered through all of these challenges and actually managed to produce a crop, there were still economic obstacles to overcome. Transportation to the markets was difficult and expensive. Without refrigeration, perishable products had to be sold quickly or preserved. Large agricultural corporations and the railroad companies used their influence to keep crop prices low and transportation costs high, squeezing the independent farmers from both directions. By the 1870s, another option was emerging on the frontier, working for wages in the growing towns and industries. Perhaps this offered a safer, more stable path than the high-risk ventures of mining, ranching, or farming. Wage labor did avoid some of the worst physical dangers and financial risks of the independent enterprises, but it introduced its own set of hardships. Industrial safety standards were virtually non-existent. Workers in frontier factories, mills, and workshops suffered horrific injuries from unguarded machinery. Construction workers built increasingly tall structures without any harnesses or safety equipment, which led to frequent fatal falls. Railroad work was particularly dangerous. The track layers worked with minimal equipment under brutal conditions, suffering high rates of injury and death from accidents, heat stroke, and exhaustion. The Chinese workers who built much of the transcontinental railroad were often assigned the most dangerous tasks, such as handling unstable explosives to blast through mountain passes. Working hours were long by modern standards, typically 10 to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. The pay was low, with most workers barely earning subsistence wages. Child labor was common, with children as young as 8 or 9 working alongside adults in many industries, often suffering higher rates of injury due to their size and inexperience. Workers had essentially no legal protections. Employers could fire people without cause, reduce their wages arbitrarily, or withhold their pay entirely. Those who complained or tried to organize for better conditions faced blacklisting, being marked as troublemakers who no other employer in the region would hire. Company towns, which were settlements where a single employer owned all of the housing and businesses, were common in mining and lumber regions. The workers in these communities paid inflated prices at the company stores, lived in company housing, and were sometimes even paid in scrip, company currency, rather than in legal tender. This created a form of debt bondage where the workers could never save up enough money to escape the system. Whether you mined, ranched, farmed, or worked for wages, life on the frontier shaped your experiences in ways that modern people would find disorienting. Perhaps the most striking difference was the relationship with time. It wasn't the carefully measured minutes and hours of our digital age, but a more fluid reality that was governed by daylight, the seasons, and natural rhythms. Without electric lighting, most people woke up at dawn and went to sleep shortly after sunset. Their active hours expanded and contracted with the seasons. Work wasn't measured in 8-hour shifts, but by the tasks that needed to be completed, fields that needed to be ploughed, cattle that had to be moved, or ore that had to be extracted. During the harvest or roundup, people might work from the first light of day until well after dark for weeks at a time without a break. During the winter, many rural workers had periods of relative inactivity when the fields lay dormant or the cattle needed only minimal tending. The concept of punctuality, which is so central to modern life, had limited relevance on the frontier. With very few clocks and a limited need for precise timing in most activities, people operated on approximate schedules. Stagecoaches, and later on trains, introduced more precise timetables to the West. But outside of these specific contexts, in the morning or after dinner were sufficiently specific time designations for most purposes. Entertainment and leisure looked nothing like their modern counterparts. After exhausting work days, most frontier folks had very little energy left for complex activities. Conversation around the fire, storytelling, or simple card games were common evening pastimes. Music was popular whenever instruments and skilled players were available, with fiddles, harmonicas, and guitars providing the accompaniment for social dances. Reading material was precious and was often shared among entire communities. A single book might be read aloud at gatherings of neighbors or passed from family to family until it fell apart from use. Newspapers, when they were available, were read repeatedly, with every advertisement and notice scrutinized for information about the wider world. Organized sports existed, but in much simpler forms than today. Baseball was gaining in popularity and was played with minimal equipment on makeshift fields. Horse racing, wrestling, and shooting competitions provided both entertainment and opportunities to demonstrate valuable skills. Children played games that required little or no equipment: tag, hide and seek, and variations of stickball that could be played with found objects. Holidays and community celebrations took on great importance as rare opportunities for socializing and recreation. 4th of July celebrations might draw people from miles around for picnics, speeches, games, and dancing. Harvest festivals marked the successful completion of the year's most critical work. Religious holidays provided both spiritual meaning and a welcome break from the routine. As the day draws to a close, you find yourself reflecting on the relentless challenges of frontier life. Every single aspect of it required harder work, involved greater risk, and offered fewer comforts than its modern equivalent. The people who survived, and sometimes even thrived, in these conditions possessed qualities that modern society rarely demands: extraordinary physical endurance, practical skills that were applicable to countless emergencies, and a psychological resilience in the face of constant hardship and loss. The darkness gathers once more, and with it comes a silence that is profound enough for you to hear your own heartbeat. There are no car engines, no air conditioners, no electronic hums, just the whisper of the wind, the chorus of insects, and the occasional call of night birds. This profound quiet, so alien to modern ears, was the soundtrack of the frontier nights, sometimes comforting and sometimes unsettling in its emptiness. As you drift towards sleep, you wonder if you would have had what it took to survive here, not just for a day or a week, but for years and decades. The people who shaped the American West, for better and for worse, were not the idealized heroes of later fiction, but complex individuals who were facing extraordinary challenges with only the limited resources and knowledge of their time. Their story, stripped of all romanticism, is one of human endurance against conditions that would break many of us today. The cool night air settles around you like a blanket, and the stars emerge in a display of brilliance that is impossible to see in our light-polluted modern world. This at least is one pure beauty that the people of the frontier experienced that few of us today can fully appreciate. The majestic sweep of the Milky Way across a truly dark sky, connecting them to the same cosmic panorama that their ancestors had watched for countless generations. Morning arrives again in the Wild West, and with it comes hunger, a constant companion on the frontier. Food in the 1870s West bore little resemblance to the varied, convenient diet you're accustomed to in the modern world. Let's explore what keeping yourself fed would actually entail in this harsh environment. The good news is that game was still relatively plentiful in many areas. Deer, elk, rabbit, and various birds could supplement your diet if you had the skills to hunt them. The bad news is that hunting required ammunition, which was expensive and might be needed for protection. It also demanded time away from other essential work, making it a luxury that many settlers couldn't afford during the busy seasons. Most frontier families relied heavily on foods that they could grow, preserve, or purchase in bulk. The staples of the frontier diet were beans, corn, and pork, dense in calories, but monotonous and nutritionally incomplete. Fresh fruits and vegetables were available only in season for a few months at most, and the winter diets often contained no fresh produce whatsoever. This lack of dietary variety led to widespread nutritional deficiencies. Scurvy, which is caused by a vitamin C deficiency, was common during the winter and early spring when no fresh produce was available. The symptoms, bleeding gums, loosening teeth, joint pain, and eventually death, were well known but difficult to prevent with the available resources. Other deficiency diseases affected the growth of children and caused various chronic health problems in adults. Food preservation was a constant challenge and a critical survival skill. Without refrigeration, meat needed to be consumed quickly or preserved through smoking, salting, or drying. These methods deterred bacterial growth but drastically changed the flavors and textures while also reducing the nutritional value. The heavy salt content of these preserved foods contributed to high blood pressure and other health issues. Women spent enormous amounts of time preserving food when it was abundant for use during the scarce periods. Vegetables were pickled in vinegar or fermented. Fruits were dried or preserved with sugar if it was available. Root vegetables might be stored in root cellars, which were underground spaces that maintained cool temperatures. These preservation efforts were not optional activities, they were essential survival work that could determine whether a family would eat during the winter or not. Food storage presented its own set of problems. Properly prepared, preserved foods could last for months or even years, but improper techniques led to spoilage and potentially deadly food poisoning. Additionally, the stored food attracted pests. Rats, mice, and insects consumed portions of most of the stored food supplies, and their droppings contaminated what remained. Most frontier families simply accepted a certain amount of insect parts and rodent droppings in their flour, beans, and other staples as just an unavoidable part of life. Cooking itself was far more labor-intensive than modern people can easily comprehend. Meals were prepared over open hearths or on wood-burning stoves that required constant attention and fuel. In the wood-scarce prairie regions, women and children might spend hours gathering buffalo chips, dried manure, or twisted grass to burn as cooking fuel. Water had to be hauled from wells or streams, often hundreds of pounds of it per day, for cooking, cleaning, and drinking. Even with all of these efforts, the meals lacked the variety and flavor profiles that modern people expect. Spices were expensive luxuries and were used sparingly, if at all. Sugar and coffee were treasured items often hoarded for special occasions. Fresh milk was available only if a family kept a cow, and then only for the part of the year when the cow was producing. Most frontier children grew up with simple, repetitive diets that would horrify modern nutritionists. Interestingly, despite these limitations, obesity was rare on the frontier. The combination of limited food supplies, minimal sugar consumption, and constant physical labor kept most people lean. However, this leanness wasn't necessarily a sign of health. Many people on the frontier suffered from malnutrition, even when they had enough calories to sustain their work. Beyond the basic survival needs like food, frontier life presented unique challenges for families who were raising children. If you had been born in the Wild West instead of just visiting it, your childhood would have been dramatically different from modern experiences. Childhood itself was conceived of differently in the 19th century. Children as young as 6 or 7 were expected to contribute meaningful work to the family's survival, not as educational chores but as essential economic contributions. Young children would mind the livestock, gather eggs, pick vegetables, watch their younger siblings, and help with countless other tasks that freed up the adults for the heavier work. By the age of 10 or 12, most frontier children were working alongside the adults at a nearly adult capacity. Boys would follow their fathers into the fields, the barns, or the workshops, learning skills through direct participation rather than through any formal instruction. Girls worked with their mothers, learning the complex domestic skills that were necessary for frontier homemaking, not just simple housekeeping, but the production of essential goods like clothing, preserved food, candles, and soap. This early entry into adulthood extended to other areas of life as well. Children were not sheltered from the harsh realities that surrounded them. They witnessed births, deaths, the slaughtering of animals, and the sometimes violent conflicts of the frontier communities. They were expected to understand and adapt to these realities rather than being protected from them. Education, as modern people understand it, was limited and inconsistent on the frontier. In the more established towns, schools might operate for a few months each year, typically during the winter, when the agricultural work was minimal. One teacher, who was often barely educated themselves, might be responsible for students ranging from 5 to 17 years old, all studying together in a single room. The physical conditions in these schools were challenging. The buildings were poorly insulated, leading to freezing conditions in the winter and stifling heat in the warmer months. Supplies were minimal, perhaps a few shared textbooks, slates for writing that had to be constantly erased and reused, and a minimal amount of paper that was treated as a precious resource. Corporal punishment was the standard disciplinary approach, with whipping or beatings being administered for infractions as minor as whispering or failing to memorize an assigned lesson. In the more remote areas, formal schooling might not exist at all. Some families conducted their own education at home, using whatever books were available, but many frontier children received only the most basic literacy and calculation skills, if that. Their education focused instead on practical knowledge, how to predict the weather, how to track animals, how to prepare the soil for planting, how to treat common injuries, and how to perform the countless other tasks that were essential for survival. Child mortality remained devastatingly high throughout the frontier period. Approximately 1 in 4 children died before they reached adulthood, with the highest risk being in the first 5 years of life. Diseases that modern medicine easily prevents or treats, measles, diphtheria, scarlet fever, whooping cough, routinely killed or permanently disabled young children. Accidents claimed many more, as child safety was a foreign concept in an era where survival itself demanded constant risk-taking. The psychological impact of this high mortality rate on both children and parents is difficult for modern people to comprehend. Most children grew up watching their siblings die. Parents expected to lose some of their children, and often gave the same name to a subsequent child if an older sibling had died young, a practice that seems strange to us today, but reflected the different relationship with mortality in an era when death was an everyday presence. Perhaps nothing illustrates the gulf between frontier and modern life more clearly than the approaches to health and medicine. If you became ill or were injured in the 1870s West, your experience would bear almost no resemblance to modern healthcare. The first major difference would be the absence of professional medical care in most situations. Doctors were scarce, with many communities having none at all. Those who did practice on the frontier often had minimal training, perhaps a brief apprenticeship, or a few months at a medical college. Their knowledge reflected the medical science of the era, which still relied heavily on theories like humoral balance that had more in common with medieval medicine than with modern practice. Without any access to professional care, most health issues were addressed through home remedies and folk medicine. Every community had people, usually women, who were known for their healing skills, drawing on traditions that had been brought from various cultures. Some of these treatments, particularly the herbal remedies, had genuine medicinal properties, but many were ineffective or actively harmful. Common medical treatments of the era included bloodletting, which weakened already ill patients, purgatives that caused severe diarrhea, supposedly to expel bad humors, and poultices of various substances that were applied to wounds, some of which actually introduced infection rather than preventing it. Laudanum, a tincture of opium, was widely used for pain, which led to addiction in many cases. Mercury compounds were prescribed for numerous conditions, despite their known toxicity. Even when treatments did have some validity, impure medications caused problems. Without any pharmaceutical regulations or standardization, commercially sold medicines varied wildly in potency and often contained dangerous contaminants. Many of the patent medicines that were marketed as cure-alls contained primarily alcohol, providing temporary relief through intoxication rather than by addressing the underlying conditions. Surgery under frontier conditions was particularly horrific. Without any effective anesthesia beyond alcohol, whiskey, or opium, patients had to endure excruciating pain during procedures. Sterilization was an unknown concept or was inconsistently practiced, which led to rampant post-surgical infections. Amputation was the standard treatment for serious limb injuries, and it was performed with saws and knives that might have been wiped clean but were never properly sterilized. Childbirth represented perhaps the starkest contrast between frontier and modern medical experiences. Women typically gave birth at home, attended by a midwife if one was available, or by female relatives if not. Without any prenatal care, many complications weren't identified until the labor was already underway. Breech births, hemorrhaging, and other emergencies that modern medicine handles routinely often resulted in the death of the mother, the child, or both. Maternal mortality rates on the frontier were approximately 1 death per 100 births, which is more than 100 times higher than in developed countries today. Many women approached each pregnancy knowing that it might be their last experience in life. The diaries and letters of men from the period frequently mention the heartbreaking reality of having to raise their children alone after losing their wives in childbirth. The combined impact of inadequate nutrition, constant physical strain, minimal preventive care, and primitive treatment options meant that the frontier populations experienced health outcomes that were more similar to those in developing nations today than to modern America. The life expectancy at birth was under 40 years, and those who survived childhood were likely to suffer from chronic health problems by their 50s, if they even lived that long. Beyond these material hardships, frontier life imposed a form of isolation and disconnection that modern people, who are accustomed to instant global communication, would find almost unbearable. This isolation shaped the psychology and culture of the frontier in profound ways. Communication with distant family or friends occurred at the speed of physical transportation. Letters took weeks or even months to reach their recipients, if they arrived at all. News traveled slowly and unreliably, and it was often distorted through retelling. Major events might not become known in the remote areas until months after they had actually occurred. This information vacuum contributed to a highly localized worldview, where distant events seemed abstract and irrelevant compared to the immediate concerns of the community. The isolation was particularly difficult for those who were accustomed to more settled environments. Women who had grown up with close female friendships and family networks often found themselves alone for days or weeks at a time, while their husbands traveled for supplies or for work. Their diaries frequently mention a crippling loneliness and the psychological strain of having no adult conversation for extended periods. This isolation sometimes led to what contemporary accounts called prairie madness, severe depression, anxiety, and occasionally psychosis that was triggered by the combination of isolation, constant work, and the environmental hardships. Some of the affected individuals became violent toward their family members or committed suicide. Others simply abandoned their homesteads and returned to the east, unable to endure the psychological pressure of frontier life. Even in the more established communities, social connections were limited by practical constraints. Visiting neighbors might require traveling several miles each way, which was a significant undertaking when time was precious and transportation was limited to walking or horseback. Formal social gatherings were infrequent and were typically centered around church services, seasonal celebrations, or community work events like barn raisings or harvest festivals. Churches played a crucial role in frontier communities that went far beyond their spiritual function. They served as social hubs, educational centers, and mutual aid societies. Even those with limited religious conviction often participated in church activities for the sense of community connection that they provided. Religious leaders, ministers, priests, or lay preachers frequently took on roles that went far beyond religious guidance, serving as teachers, dispute mediators, and community organizers. The establishment of community institutions marked important milestones in the development of the frontier. Building a school, a church, or a meeting hall represented a commitment to permanent settlement rather than just temporary exploitation. These institutions helped to transform mining camps or trading posts into towns with collective identities and shared futures. The creation of local governments, as rudimentary as they often were, similarly marked the transitions from frontier chaos to an established community. Frontier communities also developed distinctive forms of mutual aid and collective action that were necessary for survival in such harsh conditions. Barn raisings and house raisings allowed families to complete large construction projects that would have been impossible for individual households. Harvest teams would move from farm to farm, ensuring that the crops were gathered before the weather could destroy them. Spontaneous search parties would form whenever children went missing. These cooperative traditions reflected the practical reality that no single individual or family could survive the frontier entirely through self-reliance. This community interdependence existed right alongside the individualism that would later become mythologized in the frontier narratives. Both of these elements were necessary responses to the conditions of the frontier: self-reliance for daily survival and community cooperation for the challenges that were beyond any individual's capacity. The tension between these two values shaped the culture of the frontier and continues to influence American attitudes toward government, community, and individual responsibility. As another day in the Wild West draws to a close, you find yourself contemplating the mental and emotional resilience that was required to endure such conditions year after year. The people who populated the American frontier weren't superhuman. They suffered, they struggled, and they sometimes broke under the relentless pressure of their environment. But many of them adapted and persevered, developing skills and perspectives that allowed them to find meaning and even joy amidst the hardship. The darkness settles around you once more, bringing with it the profound silence of the pre-industrial night. The day's experiences have given you a glimpse into a world that is both familiar and utterly alien, a world where survival required constant vigilance, where comfort was a rarity and luxury was almost non-existent, and where death was an everyday companion rather than a distant stranger. As sleep approaches, you wonder about the people who chose this life or had it thrust upon them by circumstance. What drove them to go west? What sustained them through the blizzards, the droughts, the illnesses, and the loss? What would they think of the world that their struggles helped to create? A world of abundance and security that was beyond anything they could have ever imagined, but was built on the foundations that they laid through their exhausting labor and countless sacrifices. The questions follow you into your dreams, which are filled with endless prairies, towering mountains, and the faces of those who tamed the Wild West, not through romantic gunfights, but through the quiet heroism of daily persistence against overwhelming odds. Their story, stripped of all Hollywood glamour and frontier mythology, stands as a testament to human adaptability and the extraordinary courage of ordinary people who were facing extraordinary challenges. Dawn breaks on what will be your final day in the Wild West. As the golden light spills across the landscape, you take a moment to appreciate the raw beauty that drew so many people westward in the first place. Despite all the dangers and the hardships, the frontier was a place of stunning natural grandeur. There were vast prairies that rippled like oceans, mountains that scraped the sky, and canyons that plunged deep into the earth's depths. This beauty, at least, wasn't a Hollywood invention, but even this relationship with the natural world was profoundly different from modern environmental perspectives. The frontier mentality viewed nature primarily as a resource to be conquered and exploited, rather than to be preserved or protected. Timber was cut down without any consideration for regeneration. Game was hunted to the very edge of extinction in many regions. Streams were diverted, polluted, or destroyed for mining operations with no thought for the downstream consequences. The near extinction of the American bison or buffalo stands as perhaps the starkest example of this exploitative approach. In the 1700s, an estimated 30 to 60 million bison roamed North America. By 1884, there were fewer than 1,000 remaining. This devastation wasn't simply the result of hunting for food or hides, though that certainly played a part. It was also a deliberate policy that was encouraged by the US government as a way to deprive the Plains Indian tribes of their primary resource, thereby forcing them onto reservations. General Philip Sheridan, a key military leader in the Plains Indian Wars, reportedly stated, "Let them kill, skin and sell until the buffalo is exterminated. It is the only way to bring lasting peace and allow civilization to advance." Whether or not he actually spoke those exact words, they accurately reflect the government policy of the era. The destruction of the buffalo herds was a form of environmental warfare that was designed to break the indigenous resistance by eliminating their entire way of life. For the Native American nations all across the West, the expansion of white settlement represented an apocalypse. It wasn't just physical displacement, it was the collapse of their economic systems, their spiritual practices, and their cultural identities, which were all tied to specific landscapes and resources. While the early interactions sometimes involved trade and cooperation, by the 1870s most indigenous groups were facing a stark choice: confinement on reservations, continued resistance against overwhelming odds, or cultural assimilation. The reservation system itself represented a form of cultural genocide. Native children were forcibly removed from their families and sent to boarding schools that were designed to kill the Indian and save the man. As Captain Richard H. Pratt, the founder of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, infamously stated, "These children had their hair cut short, they were forbidden from speaking their own languages, from practicing their religions, or from maintaining their cultural identities." The intergenerational trauma from these policies continues to affect Native communities to this day. Armed resistance against American expansion almost invariably ended in defeat, though some groups did manage to maintain their independence for longer than others. The Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876, where the combined Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho forces defeated Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer's 7th Cavalry, represented one of the last major indigenous victories. The subsequent military campaigns against these tribes were marked by increasing brutality, including attacks on villages and the killing of women and children. The tragedy of this cultural collision was heightened by the fact that many native nations had sophisticated agricultural systems, complex governance structures, and rich cultural traditions that could have offered valuable knowledge to the European settlers. The different approaches to land use and ownership created fundamental misunderstandings. Many native groups couldn't even conceive of owning land any more than one could own the air or the stars, which made the treaty negotiations over territory fundamentally problematic right from the start. These cultural conflicts extended beyond the native-white relations. The West was extraordinarily diverse, with communities from all around the world bringing different languages, religions, customs, and approaches to frontier life. This diversity was both a strength, as it introduced varied skills and perspectives, and a source of tension in communities that were struggling with scarce resources and limited infrastructure. The Chinese immigrants who played crucial roles in building the Transcontinental Railroad and in developing mining operations faced particularly severe discrimination. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the first major American law to restrict immigration based on nationality, grew out of the anti-Chinese sentiment that had been festering for decades in the Western territories. Chinese miners were frequently driven from their productive claims through violence or the unjust application of foreign miners' taxes. The Chinese communities in frontier towns often faced riots and mass expulsions whenever the economic conditions deteriorated. Mexican Americans, many of whom had become U.S. citizens through territorial acquisition rather than through immigration, similarly faced discrimination and displacement. Despite the treaty guarantees that were supposed to protect their property rights following the Mexican-American War, many Mexican landowners saw their holdings taken away through legal manipulation, intimidation, or outright fraud. The Spanish-derived water rights systems that had functioned effectively for generations were replaced with English common law approaches that were less suited to the arid environments. Even the European immigrants found that their national and religious identities continued to matter on the frontier. The Irish Catholics, the German Lutherans, the Scandinavian Protestants, the Eastern European Jews, each group tended to establish its own distinct communities and maintain the cultural practices from their homelands. These communities provided mutual support, but they sometimes became the targets of nativist sentiment whenever economic or social tensions arose. African Americans who moved west after the Civil War had hoped to find freedom from Southern oppression, but they often encountered different forms of discrimination. The black cowboys, who made up approximately 25% of the workforce on some cattle operations, rarely received any recognition in contemporary accounts or in the later mythology. Black homesteaders established communities in several Western territories, but frequently faced organized resistance from their white neighbors and the discriminatory application of the homestead laws. The collision of these diverse groups, each with their own values, practices, and expectations, created frontier communities that were far more complex and conflict-ridden than the later romantic depictions would have you believe. The melting pot metaphor that was popularized in later American mythology obscured both the persistent cultural distinctiveness of the various groups and the power imbalances that determined whose cultures would be preserved and whose would be suppressed. As the day progresses, you find yourself in a frontier town that is undergoing a rapid transformation, a transition that was happening all across the West during the 1870s and 1880s. The initial phase of settlement, which was characterized by individual prospectors, independent farmers, and small-scale enterprises, was giving way to a more organized, corporate development of the Western resources. The arrival of the railroads catalyzed this transition. The Transcontinental Railroad, which was completed in 1869, dramatically reduced the travel time between the East and the West, from months to just a matter of days. Subsequent branch lines penetrated into previously isolated regions, connecting them to the national markets and supply chains. This transportation revolution allowed for the large-scale extraction of Western resources for the Eastern factories and enabled mass-produced Eastern goods to flood the Western markets. These economic connections accelerated the integration of the Western regions into the national systems, but they often disadvantaged the small producers. Independent miners couldn't compete with the large mining corporations that brought in industrial methods and capital investment. Family farms struggled against the agricultural enterprises that were operating on vast acreages. Small ranchers found themselves squeezed by the big cattle companies that had investor backing and political connections. Corporate interests increasingly came to dominate the political structures as well as the economic ones. The railroad companies, the mining conglomerates, the timber interests, and the large landholders exercised enormous influence over the territorial and early state governments. Water rights, mineral claims, grazing access, and timber concessions were all allocated through processes that typically favored those with financial and political power, rather than the small operators or the community interests. This transition from a frontier to an integrated region wasn't just economic, it was also cultural. The rough-edged mining camp or cattle town gradually acquired the institutions that signaled permanence and a connection to the wider society. Banks, schools, churches, newspapers, theatres, and fraternal organizations. Streets were surveyed and sometimes paved. The wooden structures were replaced with brick and stone buildings. Local governments enacted ordinances that regulated behavior that had previously gone ungoverned. For many of the people who had been attracted to the frontier precisely because of its freedom from the constraints of the East, These changes represented an unwelcome domestication of the wild spaces they had sought. Some of them continually moved westward, just ahead of the advancing civilization, always seeking new frontiers. Others struggled to adapt to the increasing regulation, the competition, and the social expectations. The mythological end of the frontier, which was declared in the 1890 census, represented real psychological and cultural challenges for those whose very identities were tied to the frontier conditions. Part of this transformation involved the taming, or at least the management, of the frontier violence. The iconic gunfighters and outlaws who would later dominate Western mythology operated in a specific historical window when formal law enforcement was just establishing itself against the pre-existing systems of personal and community violence. By the 1880s and 1890s, professional police forces and court systems had replaced vigilante justice in most of the established communities, though the remote areas still saw occasional eruptions of the frontier-style conflict resolution. The legendary figures who captured the public's imagination, Wild Bill Hickok, Wyatt Earp, Billy the Kid, Jesse James, all operated in this transitional period, often moving back and forth between legal and illegal activities as their circumstances changed. Their later mythologization obscured the complex and often morally ambiguous reality of their lives. Hickok, who was far from the perfect marksman of legend, actually shot bystanders in at least 2 of his gunfights. Earp worked variously as a lawman, a gambler, a brothel keeper, and a vigilante throughout his career. The Robin Hood image that was attached to Jesse James completely ignored his Confederate guerrilla background and the innocent victims of his robberies. As evening approaches on your final day in the Wild West, you find yourself contemplating the huge gap between the frontier reality and the mythology that would later emerge from it. Why did Americans and eventually the entire world become so fascinated with a romanticized version of this brutal period? What needs did these myths serve and what truths did they obscure? Part of the answer lies in the timing. The most intense period of frontier myth-making occurred precisely as the actual frontier was disappearing. The Wild West shows of Buffalo Bill Cody began in the 1880s, featuring staged reenactments of Indian battles and stagecoach robberies for Eastern audiences, even as the railroads, telegraph lines, and formal governance were integrating the Western regions into mainstream American society. These performances weren't meant to be accurate historical recreations. They were entertainment that resonated with the Eastern ideas about the West. The dime novels that popularized the exaggerated tales of Western heroes originated not on the frontier, but in the publishing houses of the East, and they were written by authors who rarely had any first-hand experience of the regions they were describing. These formulaic stories emphasized action, clear moral distinctions between heroes and villains, and a vision of the West as a testing ground for the American virtues of self-reliance, courage, and individualism. Later on, the Hollywood Westerns further refined and amplified these mythological elements, creating the iconic images of the lone cowboy, the heroic sheriff, the dastardly outlaw, and the savage Indian that bore little resemblance to the historical reality. These films served psychological and cultural functions that went beyond mere entertainment. They offered reassuring narratives about the American identity during periods of rapid social change and international challenges. The mythology suggested that the American character had been forged in the conditions of the frontier, producing exceptional qualities that distinguished the nation from the older societies. It implied that the American expansion across the continent had been not just inevitable, but morally justified, a triumph of civilization over the wilderness and of progress over primitive cultures. It presented simplified moral frameworks where good invariably triumphed over evil through righteous violence, which in turn justified America's growing military and economic power on the world stage. What these myths obscured was the complex, morally ambiguous reality of the development of the West. the genocide of indigenous peoples, the exploitation of immigrant labor, the environmental devastation, the corporate manipulation of the political systems, and the deeply divided communities that were struggling with fundamental questions about identity, governance, and resources. The real West offered no simple moral lessons, but rather a case study in how human societies adapt to challenging conditions, sometimes showing remarkable cooperation and creativity, and sometimes descending into exploitation and brutality. As darkness falls once more, you reflect on your brief journey through the unromanticized Wild West. You've experienced firsthand why the average person today, who is accustomed to abundant food, medical care, physical safety, and countless comforts that were completely unknown to the frontier dwellers, would likely not survive even a single day in the actual conditions of the 1870s frontier. The skills, the knowledge, the physical conditioning, and the psychological resilience that were required for frontier survival represent a way of life that is so distant from modern experience as to be almost unimaginable. Yet something about this world continues to fascinate us. Perhaps it's the raw honesty of a life that was stripped down to its essentials, where tasks had immediate consequences and achievements represented tangible victories against the constraints of nature. Perhaps it's the community interdependence that emerged from the shared challenges, creating connections that transcended any differences in background or belief. Or perhaps it's simply the reminder that human beings are capable of enduring and even finding meaning in conditions that are far harsher than most of us will ever have to face. The legacy of the American frontier extends beyond the mythology and into the actual structures and systems that shape modern American life. Property laws, water rights frameworks, the relationships between the federal and state governments, our approaches to natural resources and countless other aspects of American governance all emerged from the compromises and conflicts of the frontier era. The diversity of the Western communities, despite the efforts at forced assimilation, contributed to the multicultural reality of modern America. Even the continuing tensions between individual rights and the collective welfare, between local control and national standards, between exploitation and conservation, all have their roots in the debates of the frontier era. For the indigenous peoples, the frontier era represents not a glorious chapter in national expansion, but the devastation of their ancient lifeways and the beginning of a long struggle for cultural survival and sovereignty that continues to this day. Their perspective reminds us that the simple, triumphalist narrative of Western settlement completely ignores the complex civilizations that already existed and the incalculable knowledge that was lost through their disruption. The most accurate understanding of the frontier requires holding multiple perspectives at the same time, acknowledging both the courage of those who built new communities in challenging conditions and the devastation that was experienced by those who were displaced by this expansion. As you drift towards sleep on your final night in the Wild West, the sounds of this earlier America surround you. The whisper of the wind through the prairie grass, the distant howl of the coyotes, perhaps the faint piano notes from a saloon down the street. These sensory experiences at least connected everyone who lived through this era. Regardless of their background or their circumstances, the vast skies, the extreme weather, the imposing landscapes, and the profound silences shaped everyone who encountered them, creating a shared relationship with the environment even in the midst of the cultural conflict. Tomorrow, you'll return to your own time, carrying with you a deeper understanding of this pivotal period in American history. You'll never again see a Western film or read a frontier novel without recognizing the sanitized, simplified version of a much more complex reality. You'll appreciate the extraordinary comfort and security of modern life, which were achieved through technological advances that were unimaginable to the frontier dwellers. You might find yourself more aware of the skills and the knowledge that have been lost in the transition to our specialized, technology-dependent society, the practical self-sufficiency that allowed the people of the frontier to build, repair, grow, preserve, and create what they needed with only minimal outside support. And most importantly, you'll understand that the real story of the American West isn't found in the gunfights and the gold strikes, but in the daily struggles of ordinary people, men, women, and children from diverse backgrounds who faced extraordinary challenges with only the limited resources that were available to them. Their story, without any Hollywood embellishment, contains enough genuine courage, tragedy, innovation, conflict, cooperation, cruelty, and kindness to fill countless histories. Their legacy lives on in the communities they established, the environmental changes they initiated, the cultural patterns they created, and the myths that grew from their experiences. The real Wild West disappeared a long time ago, transformed by technology, population growth, economic integration, and environmental change into the modern American West, of cities, suburbs, highways, and managed landscapes. Yet echoes of the frontier experience persist in regional identities, local traditions, land use patterns, and governance structures. The memory of this formative period continues to influence how Americans understand themselves and their nation's development, even as scholars and communities work to replace the simplistic mythology with more accurate, inclusive understandings of this complex history. As you finally surrender to sleep, the boundary between the past and the present seems to blur. The challenges that were faced by the frontier communities, adapting to environmental constraints, managing scarce resources, building functional communities among diverse populations, balancing individual freedom with the collective needs, all remain relevant in new forms today. Perhaps the greatest legacy of the frontier experience is not a set of answers, but a collection of questions about human adaptation, community formation, and the relationship between people and the natural world. Questions that each generation must answer anew as circumstances change. The stars shine brilliantly above you, the same stars that guided travelers across the prairie, that helped farmers to time their planting, and that gave comfort to homesick immigrants who were far from their familiar landscapes. In this moment of connection across time, you feel a fleeting kinship with those who looked upon these same constellations a century and a half ago, wondering what tomorrow would bring in a world where survival was never guaranteed, but where life, in all of its harshness and its beauty, was experienced with an intensity that is seldom matched in our more comfortable era. Sleep comes at last, and with it, dreams of a West that was both harsh and magnificent, a place where human vulnerability and resilience were displayed in equal measure, where diverse peoples collided and sometimes cooperated in ways that would shape a nation, and where the daily struggle for existence contained moments of transcendent connection with landscapes of breathtaking grandeur. The real Wild West, stripped of all its romantic illusion, offers a window into the human experience at its most elemental, challenging, frightening, and occasionally sublime.